and welcome to the sneak peek of the prologue for the Fall of Ingway. Basically, the prologue of the story is structured differently from the rest. The rest is much more dynamic with characters going back and forth, multiple actors. It's much more like a movie. The prologue is very heavy on the narration, and it's laying the groundwork, giving you an idea of the myth behind Rehavan, of the creation story that lends power to all the gods that play a part in the Fall of Ingway. I hope you enjoy this story. I'll lay out some of the influences, some of the religions that play a part, some of the myths that play a part, and I really hope it's interesting to get a little glimpse into the backstory of this world. If you're curious at all, if you enjoy this video, remember to check out the Kickstarter. Links below.
Phasia lived and faced the void. Together they were, and nothing else. No matter, no time, no breath, no will. But Phasia felt and named his feeling need. He dreamed of actions and space to contain them. Unwinding a thread of self, he cast it forth and called it time, that history might grace it like beads.
I would like to mention here. One is something I drew directly from religion, and one is something that I took with no particular outside influence, but I thought would be worth mentioning because I find it interesting. Hopefully you will too. The first is an idea drawn from Christianity. So Christianity posits this idea that God must exist outside of time, that God must have basically created time. The idea runs that if we exist at a fixed point on the timeline, then time extends eternally forward and eternally backward on either side of us. And since there's no way to have traversed infinity, time could have never reached our current fixed point across the entire infinite past. So Christianity answers this question by saying, well, if God exists outside of time and creates time, then that gives time a fixed beginning point, and you no longer have an infinite behind our current point and an infinite after. You have a finite portion behind us and an infinite portion afterwards. And so we've only traversed this finite portion to reach where we are currently. And I really am fascinated by that idea. And so I used that in my story, and I said, okay, so my creative being Phasia exists outside of the timeline. He creates time, and when he creates it, it's actually a novel concept to himself. It's something new. The second idea kind of spins off of this in a way, and I said, okay, so what exists in the beginning? There's Phasia and there's the void. I'll talk a little bit more about the void later. She plays a big part in the creation mythos, but focusing now on just the creation idea, Phasia needs something to make time out of, needs something to draw time from, and it's either him or the void. So he draws time from himself and essentially unspools himself to create this thread of time. And because of that, time is finite and Phasia is finite. And as Phasia unspools himself and time runs out before him and history unfolds, he lessens over time until finally, when time expires, so does he. So much of religion and myth deals with sacrifice. Every religion is pervaded by concepts of sacrifice, and they differ from each other in subtle ways and in not so subtle ways, but they all circle around this idea of sacrifice. And I thought it was really interesting, really poetic, the idea to have God's sacrifice be the act of creating, that the intrinsic act of putting forth a beautiful thing into the world demands a sacrifice of the being who puts it forth, and that in that initial creation, the sacrifice is Phasia himself. So that's kind of where my idea for time unspooling came from, the idea of God sacrificing to create beauty, to create something external. So yes, that's the basic idea of where time came from in Rehavan.
By what is, I craft what shall be. Time, cause, effect. What else to fill the dark? I need self. Selves. I need other selves. What makes me self? I am curious. Live curiosity. Be a soul. I grieve. Live grief. Be a soul.
One after another, he made them. Endurance, mercy, anger, eros, and 100 more beside. Every soul drawn from a facet of Phaesia's self. Lastly, he made them a stage, formed from the void that had always been. A panoply of spheres dangling in the empty, some of earth and some of fire.
Go, my children, learn and hunger. These are worlds, the others stars. Make what brings you pleasure.
And his children went forth and learned and hungered. They took a name and called themselves Passions. Sharing this name, they discovered kinship and the longing for a home, a place to be both one and many. So they chose a sphere, a realm of earth and water, fallen into consort with a star, trapped in besotted orbit. There they settled and basked in the light of their star, and in darkness when their star was hidden. To and from this sphere they travelled, exploring what Phaesia had made, meeting others, learning they were not alone. The forces were no younger nor older than the passions. They had risen from the void like reflections, necessities forced to life by the presence of the passions, akin, but separate. Colder, less prone to flight or rage, love or laughter, they had purpose.
And what are these, silent void? You surprise me now, after eternal quiet.
Mentioned earlier. I said I would talk a little bit more about that, and so this is a good place to do so. I've always loved the idea of yin and yang, of a world at balance between light and dark, feminine and masculine, action and passivity. In the West, we have our own dualities, but often they are conflict-driven. Right versus wrong, lies versus truth, strength versus weakness, something versus nothing. But the duality of yin and yang is different. It's a set of dualities where it's not a negative versus a positive. It's not a good versus a bad. It's a kind of duality where the two things are harmonious and each operate best when complementing the other equally, when both are prominent and represented. And there's even the idea of the smaller circle within the larger bulk of each, so that when the world is at harmony, light and dark hold equal portions, and also there's a portion of light in the darkness and a portion of darkness in the light. And likewise with masculine and feminine, there's a portion of masculinity in the feminine, a portion of femininity in the masculine, and both equally represented, forming a half of the whole. I've always loved that idea of a harmonious balance based around dualities and around opposites. I wanted something like that in Rehavan. So I created Phaesia and the Void together. Phaesia the masculine, the void the feminine. And in the fleshly world, Phaesia is the act of God and the creator. But in the spirit world, the roles reverse. As Phaesia unspools himself, creating time, as he runs out his own self into the ether, creating time out of his own essence, he passes into shadow and becomes the passive. Meanwhile, the void in the spirit world, in the world that is other than matter, increases. And after the last bit of the thread of time runs out, then the void begins unspooling her own thread of time, and you have the after, the spirit world that's spoken about in the different stories set in Rehavan, the place where Ingway guides souls to after they pass. And in that world, the void is supreme, Phaedra is passive. And it becomes a cycle, a kind of wheel where you move from one form of time to the other, and Phaedra rises in prominence and then fades from prominence, and the void rises to prominence and then fades from prominence, and you get this cycle of return and return as each unspools itself into the other, and then the other unspools itself into them. So this is one of the larger real-world influences that went into my mythology. I feel like I used it fairly uniquely, but it is drawn largely from different Eastern religions. You know, I've always enjoyed reading like the Bhagavad Gita and the Tao Te Ching and kind of seeing these other systems of thought that are a little sometimes parallel, but sometimes completely different from the way we view the world in the West. And I really wanted to incorporate elements of those into my stories. And I hope I did so in a way that felt fresh and interesting and not merely a recycling. So yeah, that was part of the creation myth.
The forces were many, though not so many as the passions. They were time and dream, fate, chance, luck, Gaia, dozens more, and all but one, the passions accepted, the quiet one with the soft voice and gentle touch. His first name was Ingway, though he would hold 1,000 others from age to age. Ferryman, Shadow Lord, Reaper, Stranger, Death. Yes, Death, for he was the god of endings, he who came when final thoughts were pondered and final sighs released. He was the one who told the passions that their frivoling would end, that all with thought must die.
Influence of the void on the physical world, the importance of her creations. They provide the framework within which the passions gambol. They're the administrators and functionaries of the laws of the universe, including the highest of all laws, one from which even Phaedra will not escape, the law of death.
Before his quiet voice, the passions recoiled and murmured and cursed and feared. An outcast among gods, Ingway made his home on a smaller sphere, orbiting the home of his brethren and cousins. A sphere of two sides, one that faced the world and one that faced away. Ingway chose the second. He had little cause in those centuries to labour, little cause to meddle in the affairs of his brethren or cousins, for no gods perished. None passed on for him to guide in the after. He did not witness when Phaedra first handed down his power to the passions in the form of a beautiful lyre. He did not see when curiosity plucked its strings and made matter sing, made elements multiply, made a world of diverse things. Ingway only saw the effects, for with each new note drawn from the lyre, even his barren sphere grew more varied and more strange. When imagination took up the lyre and made new life, only then did Ingway stir, for he felt the beat of hearts in the webbing of the world, the newness of fleshly existence. Brief, weak, trifling figures whom Ingway would often need to gather. Later, Eros made the merfolk and endurance the minotaurs, Philia the elves, and curiosity man. The races multiplied, and Ingway reaped among them all, ferrying souls from the world of matter to the world of spirit to be judged by the passions they served. From there, he led them to the after, to the embrace of the welcoming void.
See just a brief mention of an idea that is much better developed in my creation myth in the front matter of Ariel's Tear. It's one of the earliest, perhaps the earliest, ideas I had for the creation story. And it's the idea that the races are crafted not by one perfect god, but rather by individual traits and passions. There's an old philosophy called Gnosticism that holds to a number of tenets and fits itself into multiple religions, though it's best known for its corruptive influence on early Christianity. It's not really inherent to any religions, but it's its own little sub-philosophy that then influences different sects of other religions when Gnostics adopt those other religions. So one of its main tenets is the idea that spirit is good, flesh is bad, never the twain shall meet. So when the Gnostics adopted Christianity, they were left with this conundrum of, okay, you have the supposedly perfect spirit creating corrupt flesh that disagrees with our ideas. So they introduced to the Old Testament a bunch of sub-deities so that you can have this gradual step-by-step degradation between spirit and flesh, where God creates a lesser spirit, creates a lesser spirit, creates a lesser spirit, creates flesh, and then you don't have to have this mixing of imperfection and perfection because you have these different steps in between. And I found that idea interesting. Like, it flies in the face of Christianity, and it flies in the face of the other Eastern religions that Gnosticism crept into. But nonetheless, these people held to both. You know, they adopted both and made them jive together for them. And I found that really interesting. So I wanted to create a parallel idea in Rehavan, where the beings of Rehavan, the flesh folk, are not necessarily representative of one high, ultimate creative god, but rather of a host of narrower beings. So you have minotaurs created by endurance, humans created by curiosity, elves created by philia or familial love, and gnomes created by guile. And because you have these narrower subsets of traits that have primary input on these races, it opens up a really cool opportunity for introducing themes, because I have pre-baked conceptions about these races that people can work with and identify with. So when you have that groundwork already laid, access to themes becomes much more ready and much more interesting and nuanced. So it's one of the earliest choices that was made in the creation process, and probably one of the most helpful.
There were halls in the after that no god but Ingway had ever seen. Worlds beyond what Phasia had made, that only Ingway trod. They ran on a thread of time that Phasia had not formed, but rather the void, a thread that ran parallel to Phasia's, but separate, where the void was god of all and Phasia a silent counterpart, where he was the void and she the creator. In the after, every passion and every force had already died, had already lived the entirety of immortality and ended and passed. In the after, they had dwelt and ruled their halls and inherited the souls that had served them in all the history of Phasia's world. And only Ingway saw both threads. Only Ingway knew the ending of every god, how corrupted they would grow, how cruel or kind or foul or clean. For the gods did not remain as Phasia had made them, patterned from his perfect being. They changed. Some evolved. Some decayed. Their names altered to match. Discretion became malice. Justice became cruelty. In time, these diverse gods developed jealousies and contests, struggles for power and glory. They dared not strike each other, knowing that Ingway waited to reap them. But they gathered followers among the flesh folk and set up tiny kingdoms to war by proxy.
And the forces diluting and changing over time is very important, not just to understanding the individual passions and traits in the world of Rehavan, but also to understanding how they exist and why they exist. Phasia is not himself cruel. So how does a deity of cruelty exist when all of these deities were created modeled after Phasia's individual traits? The answer is because beings change, because souls shift, particularly when they rub up against each other and experience things together and see other people's perspective, other souls' experiences. It alters them. So you might have a deity of justice who is capable of violence, but holds it in reserve until it's justified. And then you might have a being who is malicious and delights in that. And when you have justice rubbing up against all these other beings, experiencing their viewpoints, their feelings, their ideas, his own perspective might shift, and that capacity for violence that was once withheld might lose its mercy, might lose the components that keep it in reserve, and that being that was once just might shift into enjoying the capacity for violence and become cruelty. So the Fall of Ingways is in many ways the story of how gods change, of Ingwe growing influenced by the goddess of mercy, for good or for ill.
Abhorred by their violence, Phasia deserted the passion's realm and abandoned them to their debaucheries, sealing off their world of matter, retreating all that remained of himself to his original, lonely existence. The passions were free to riot.
Come across another religious influence, deism. Deism is often described as the great clockwinder god, a god who winds up the universe, sets it ticking in the void, and then just steps back and lets it go and wind itself out into exhaustion. The deists believe in a god, a prime cause, but not in a god who interacts with the universe, not in a Christ or an Allah or a Yahweh or even a Brahma. They believe in a creator who made things and then just wandered off to do his own deal elsewhere. Phasia takes on a bit of that here. He sets himself apart, lets the free will of the beings he's created run rampant, lets them make a heaven or hell of the world of time and matter. He washes his hands of them. Or does he? Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed that preview of what is to come in the Fall of Ingway. I hope you enjoyed hearing about where some of these ideas come from. The story proper is rather different from this prologue and structure. There's more voice acting, more interaction back and forth. It's more like a movie. This portion has a lot more narration, but I think the background matters, and I thought it was a good way to introduce the world. Thanks for watching. Have a lovely day, and please consider backing the Kickstarter if you enjoyed this at all. Links are below. There's also a trailer here on the YouTube channel, and you can find my links to the socials in all the descriptions. Thanks so much. Enjoy.